the most senior US government official who's permitted to talk publicly about US government policy on illicit drugs. This comes from the State Department. There's the website, and the State Department in the US, equivalent to DFAT in Australia. William Brownfield said this on October the 9th, that we must have enough flexibility to allow us to incorporate those changes into our policy. Now, this is something that the US had built a whole international system on inflexibility and imposed that inflexibility on other countries. And now the US is now starting to recognize that this system cannot last and is allowing it to slowly implode. And there's the Department of State on C Street in Washington, DC, and that bureau is where Brownfield works is on the top floor. So things are starting to fall apart, and the centre cannot hold, and here's another major event. This was the 25 years ago, that is the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're not going to see anything as dramatic as this with drug law reform. It's going to be a slow evolutionary process. These kind of sudden dramatic events are very rare in policy change. But I think this is what we're going to see. So it's a process. We have to remember that prohibition itself was a process, is a process. And arguably it was started at a meeting in China in 1909. And for the next 80 years, the program got bigger and bigger around the world, and it's only now starting to contract and be replaced by drug law reform. All social justice reforms are very slow, and victories, unfortunately, if we're lucky, they're partial, and sometimes we get very little at all. And if we look at the abolition of slavery and how long that took in the United States, took 300, 400 years, and that process isn't complete either. If we look at women in the audience might agree that the victory for them has been only partial, and likewise with gay rights and Aboriginal Australians. It's a terrific YouTube clip by Ira Glasser, former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, talking about the long arc of social justice, talking about why social reforms take such a long time. So what do we have to do? We have to keep making these arguments. People are now starting to listen to them and recognize that they're serious arguments and that they're correct. We have to remind people that drug prohibition has been seriously counterproductive, that it's been a costly way of getting terrible outcomes, and it's fundamentally unfair and unjust. We have to recognize that sometimes these kind of reforms, difficult for everybody, are slightly less difficult for conservatives. Remember, Nixon goes to China. No democratic US president could have ever carried out that reform. And we have to start attacking the low-hanging fruit, which is something I try to do. Is that all there is to it? No, there's much more to it than that, I'm afraid. I think that it's important that we have to remember keeping unemployment low, especially youth unemployment, is very important to getting better outcomes from illicit drugs. And Australia has been increasing inequality for the last 30 years under Labor and coalition governments, and inequality has been increasing more rapidly in Australia than any other OECD country apart from the United States. And this has clearly been very bad for in terms of psychoactive drugs. So, drug prohibition has failed abjectively, and this is now being widely acknowledged. About time. Drug law reform is not going to start, it has already started. The threshold step is redefining the issue as primarily a health and social issue. And that requires proper funding for health and social interventions, which have previously got very limited funding. Changing the thresholds and sanctions for so-called drug crimes, very important part of this, as is the beginning of the process of regulating what drugs we can. And I think reducing inequality has to also be added to the mix. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Swoboda. Thank you, sir. All right, and with that, it's lunch. We're back here at 1:20, please. Back here, 1:20.